quite jet lagged. So, but I'll try not to do that too much. I've been thinking for a long time, off and on, about how to integrate socio-cultural issues into an ecological approach. I'm not inclined toward eclectic theory. I mean, I really want to think about how these kinds of concerns can be integrated without too much adjustment into the Gibson framework. And that's sort of the broad context for what I was talking about. I changed the title a bit, and really what I want to say is why place matters to us. That is, as ecological psychologists. Okay, so with some things that should be fairly familiar to all of you, Gibson begins chapter 3 of his ecological approach book by drawing a distinction between physical reality and ecological reality, and he wants to say one important difference between the two is that when we perceive the entities of environmental science, their meanings can be discovered. And then he goes on in this chapter to offer a nomenclature, an ecological nomenclature for surface layout. In other words, he's trying to develop the vocabulary that he wants to work with. And you're familiar with all of these, I'm sure, surfaces, medium, ground, et cetera, But then if you keep reading down the list, place appears at the end, and that's really what I want to talk about today. And this is Gibson's definition of place. It's a location in the environment as contrasted with a point in space, a more or less extended surface layout that can be located by its inclusion in a larger place. Most importantly, what I want to emphasize is what's highlighted there, but the habitat of an animal is made up of places. Then later in the book, and that's about all he says at this point, and then later in the book he talks about place a little bit more, but he doesn't go very far with it. The best that are his examples that he offers of sleeping places, eating places, and meeting places, hiding places, and falling off places. And what I want to say, I think there's a real problem with this list. So let's talk about sleeping places. I mean, what makes for a sleeping place? I mean, it should afford shelter, protection, warmth, and so on. But for humans, sleeping places go beyond this, right? That is to say, sleeping places sort of fit into a larger social context that has social significance. That typically a sleeping place is in a home. There's layers of social significance like ownership, privacy, rituals for entering, and in the context of the home, the bedroom offers high levels of privacy, intimate interactions, et cetera, as well as expressions of self-identity, if that's your preference, or perhaps some of you might prefer that as an expression of self-identity. But the same thing is true in the case of eating places, and again, I think Gibson conflates these differences here. So eating places are obviously places where you can find food, but in the human sphere, they're much more than that. They have great social significance. And eating places are corner cafes, fashionable restaurants, cafeterias, neighborhood delis, and even diners. And so this mixture of uses for the term place for both non-human and human instances seems to lump both types under a common heading. And it points to a recurring difficulty, I think, in Gibson's writing. Oh, I did have one more reading places, yes. The recurring difficulty is, as I said at the outset, how to integrate a sociocultural dimension into the framework of ecological psychology while remaining consistent with the approach's commitments. And that the last part is important to me. Now, first, such an integration might seem to run counter to the long-standing tendency to treat the natural and the cultural as two different categories. But if you've read Gibson closely, you'll know that Gibson doesn't want to do that. He writes, it's a mistake to separate the natural from the artificial as if they were two environments. Artifacts have to be made from natural substances. It's a mistake to separate the cultural environment from the natural environment as if there were two worlds, a world of mental products and material products. There's only one world. So the natural and, if you will, the sociocultural are not different worlds in any ontological sense. There exists but one world of natural phenomena. an ecological psychology embraces a uniform ontology. However, and what I wanted to indicate here is that the natural cultural distinction just echoes with other kinds of dichotomies that have reappeared through intellectual history. However, here I'm going to depart from Gibson and refer to a paper by Alan Costello and Ann Richards, who I think helpfully claim that it would be a mistake to take this ontological point that it just made as a basis for minimizing the very real differences that sociocultural processes introduce into the natural world. The fact that humans are steeped in cultural processes introduces complexities and new possibilities for our way of being in the world that differs from other animals. Indeed, there are innumerable ways in which various species have made their way in the world. There is one world in an ontological sense, but in terms of ways of living, there are multitudes. And this circumstance proliferates when we introduce symbolic processes, and here we're concerned with the human ways of living. One other point I want to bring up, and this is a comment that Dewey made back in the 20s, and I think this is somewhat symptomatic of ecological psychology. The character of everyday experience, which has been most systematically ignored by philosophy, and I would say psychology, especially the Anglo-American tradition, is the extent to which it is saturated with the results of social interpersonal communication. The second challenge, obviously, though, is how to introduce sociocultural issues while remaining consistent with the central tenet of ecological psychology, namely that we perceive the world directly. So let me just give you an example of this, and many of you are familiar with this example that Gibson brings up for a somewhat different reason in his book. But it talks about the example that Kafka had offered of the fact that a post box invites the mailing of a letter. Now Gibson brings this up to kind of distance himself from Kafka, but Gibson insists that the affordances of the post box, like all affordances, is perceived directly. It's not imposed on the experience of the environment. It's there independently of the momentary needs of the perceiver. At first glance, Gibson's position here appears to be difficult to justify. For how can the affordance of a mailbox be directly perceived when the act of mailing a letter takes for granted so much that is seemingly imperceptible, such as what postal system are, and we're basically what correspondence is. So that's really the challenge I want to try to face up to. So how does Gibson try to defend this claim? He writes, I prefer to say that the real post box, the only one, affords letter mailing to a letter-writing human in a community with a postal system. This fact is perceived when the post box is identified as such. And what I want to do is just emphasize this again. He's actually making a really fine point here that doesn't develop in other places. And that is, he's not saying that the post box affords mailing for any living thing, nor even that a post box affords mailing for all human beings. Rather, it affords mailing a letter to a letter-writing human in a community with a postal system. In other words, he embeds it in a social system. In other words, there's something about being a participant in a particular community that makes perceiving this affordance realizable. And I think this point goes to the heart of what we mean by affordances when we're talking in the human domain. While there's only one world in an ontological sense, between species there are multiple ways of living, as I said before. So my attempt, I've been worrying about this for a while. My earliest attempt to try to bring a Gibsonian and a sociocultural view together was in a paper I wrote in the late 80s, believe it or not. And what I tried to do there was to draw on some of Merleau-Ponty's concepts to see how we might think about Gibson in a cultural context. So Merleau-Ponty, with his influence, we could say that affordances can be extended to sociocultural phenomena when we bear in mind that an individual is an embodied agent. Affordances are discovered in the course of exploration, and because of these experiences, that is, these attunements of the body, individuals carry with them an embodied history of prior environment action engagements. In Merleau-Ponty's terms, the body is a vehicle of being in the world, and having a body for a living creature is to be involved in a definite world. Our body has a potentiality of this or that part of the world, surges toward objects to be grasped and perceives them. By the way, when I first started looking at Merleau-Ponty, I was wondering, well, how familiar might Gibson have been with this literature? And as some of you know, he read Merleau-Ponty's work. He verified that to me. So, and the fact that it influenced his work deeply. Okay. But in the years since I offered this proposal, it's become clear to me that this account doesn't go far enough. Because what we need to do is embed the properties of objects in not just in embodied skills, but also in skills considered as in a sociocultural context. So as I said earlier, well, I'm not go to that yet. So the affordance is perceived in relationship to a set of social practices. What is necessary is that the postbox be perceived as such, as a postbox. That's what Gibson writes. And perceiving it as a postbox involves more than understanding that is an attached object that can function as a container. It involves perceiving it as a part of an extensive social system. In other words, to identify it as a postbox necessitates bringing a background of practical understanding to the situation. Now, if you read the philosophical literature, you know that the word background actually has a very specific meaning. And I won't have a lot of time to go into it, but background comes up in Heidegger's writings as well as Dreyfus's accounts of Heidegger. It also comes up in Searle's work, although they use it slightly differently. But what they mean by this is that the individual, each of us, brings to any moment of experience a history of practices as a social being, which function as a background for current activity. So let's return to mailing a letter. In this case, the background of the act includes some rough and ready understanding that a postal system entails depositing a letter in one location, followed by a series of unseen operations that culminate in a letter arriving in the hands of the addressee. But more than that, there's understanding of what a letter is, what an address means, why postage is necessary, what it means to correspond. And there's layers and layers of meaning. And this one acquires as a participant in a social system that has a postal system in letter writing. So what is the nature of this understanding of social practices? I'm going to skip over that. Charles Taylor has written very insightfully about this, and he claims that understanding he's talking about human experience now, is always situated against the background of what is taken for granted, just relied upon. These practices are not carried out in acts of single agents. A great deal of human action happens only insofar as the agent understands and constitutes himself or herself as an integral part of a we. Because our collective actions are underwritten by shared meanings, each individual has acquired by virtue of developing in a common culture a sense of meaningful practical actions. What I want to add here, and these are issues that I've talked about at other conferences, it's important to remember that the young in human societies develop through their participation in social practices. Our understanding stems from a history of attunements through participation in social practices. It's a practical mastery of sociocultural, I'm so jet-lagged, practical mastery of sociocultural significant patterns of action in relation to affordances. Okay. Hence, as Peter Perdue writes, practical mastery, and this has such a nice ecological ring to it, is transmitted in practice in a practical state without attaining a level of discourse. Body hexis speaks directly to the motor function in the form of patterns of postures that is both individual and systematic, because it's linked to a whole system of techniques involving the body and tools and charged with a host of social meanings and values. Okay, so I want to also remind us something that I'm sure we both know. First of all, that humans require a social environment for development. A human doesn't develop normally without having others around them. And secondly, and this is something that's a little less clear to us because of we're the only hominids still left on Earth, but in fact, hominid evolution was a process by which we developed in relationship to culture being in place already. So when we're talking about humans, we're not adding culture to the story. In fact, in some ways, culture is there prior to the evolution of human beings. It's really fundamental. So to move on to the next point, if we're addressing affordances from this perspective, it introduces a new set of considerations, and this is something that Eric will talk more about than I will, and this is the issue of normativity. That is to say, there's an important difference between perceiving a surface as sit-onable versus perceiving a surface of comparable dimensions as somewhere one ought not sit for a variety of reasons. Normativity is integral to social practices because the meaning, the social significance, is so vital to human experience. So, let's return now to place. So, if we talk about places, normativity plays a significant role in each case. There are many locations where I could sleep. They afford shelter, a comfortable surface, protection, but where I ought not sleep, it is my neighbor's bedroom in my neighbor's house. Likewise, there are locations where I could find food and drink, but could not due to a lack of proper attire, not being a member of a club, of the club whose territory it is. There are meeting places for people to gather, but set criteria have been established as that we can enter. Each of us develops these labyrinthine understandings about place through our persistence in social practice. We have a deep understanding of what's appropriate in various social settings as a result of our development. So the affordances of places are understood in relation to our individual histories, our ongoing practical mastery of engaging in a set of shared sociocultural practices. Okay, let me make 3 quick points and then I'll conclude. First of all, I wanted to, why does the concept of place matter for us? Well, first, the recognition of the significance of place in human ways of living compels us to consider affordances in a new light. In other words, the affordance of an object changes as a function of the place it might be located in. For example, a piece of pottery in a store may afford picking up and examining, but not so a piece in a museum. These differences hinge upon what are normatively appropriate actions in these two settings. The perception of affordances is situated in ways which we have hardly yet considered. Now, 2, but in this I'm now having in mind the work of Roger Barker, places considered as entities themselves offer a vast world of possibilities for human experience that would not exist otherwise. Places have affordances for individuals who are familiar with the relevant practices that constitute those places. By participating in places, individuals are afforded experiences and developmental possibilities that might otherwise not be possible. So we come together and form places, which then creates opportunities and experiences that we otherwise would not have. But the nicest thing about this example is you just point to the situation we're in right now. Our coming together and sort of establishing certain normative practices allows for communication of ideas. We've created this place. And third, and this was the topic of my talk at EUAC last summer, the treatment of place does not undermine ecological psychology's commitment to both the naturalistic ontology and to direct perception. First of all, places are naturally occurring phenomena. For example, we could talk about a place as being located in a certain place at a certain time. We can be very specific about this place in terms of its location and its temporal boundaries. It occurs naturally out of our activity. And as for the direct perception claim, what I've been trying to do over the last few years is carry out some research which demonstrates that, in fact, the affordances of a place are perceivable. And I didn't bring the animations with me, but here are some stills from the animations. In our experiments, what we're doing is we're having people look at these columns which are moving. And basically, these are simulations of very real settings in the town. And essentially, what they're asked to do is identify what's going on here. It's essentially a detection of structure from motion kind of problem. And the question is, can you perceive what the setting is based on these patterns of movements? And what we found so far, we've run a couple of experiments, have another one going on right now, is that people are really pretty good. That is to say, I'd like to argue that the affordances of a place, what a place affords for an individual, is perceivable, but I need a lot more data to support that claim. Okay, so you might feel like I drifted very far from ecological psychology, but now I want to come back to it, and this is my concluding comment, and it draws on some relatively recent work by Mike Kirby and Tony Chamorro. I think they very helpfully demonstrated in logical terms how ecological psychology deviates from sort of a standard Newtonian account. And what they're doing is they distinguish between predicative definitions and non-predicative definitions. And so in the case of a predicative definition, A, B, and C are all members of the set E, the components of that set. However, if we're looking at living systems, what we need to do is think about a different type of logic, in which case the components of the system also constitute the set of which they are a member. And so in other words, in our case here, each of us are behaving in normative ways that help create the very setting, which also then continues to constrain our behavior. So I think the logic that Michael and Tony used to try to talk about affordances and organism action can be also bumped up a level to talk about what Barker called behavior settings. So, to conclude, an object may have a particular affordance in a normative sense in the context of a particular place of which the object is a constituent. And we might, to borrow Alan Costell's phrase, we might call the normative perceived function of an object its canonical affordance. That is to say, the object, let me take an example of, let's say, an eating utensil like a fork. I mean, the presence of eating utensils help to constitute the larger setting of a dining room, but then the fact that they're in the dining room and constrains their usage. The second thing is that in predicativity, it describes the individual's relationship to place. That is, by participating in a place, certain possibilities are available, as I'll try to demonstrate there. And so you can see in this case, each of the individual members of the baseball team, in fact, they individually constitute the set of which they are a member. So in these regards, it seems to me that this treatment of place seems to be in keeping with the underlying logic of living systems and, of course, ecological psychology. Thank you.
So I was thinking perhaps we could wait for questions to the very end of the symposium for questions and discussion. If that's okay?